Hi everyone! Because we're doing a Victoria sponge masterclass.
I really need you to hear what I'm saying.
Victoria sponge is a really classic cake and everyone or most people like Victoria sponge apart from my daughter who only likes chocolate cake. And we're doing ours with cream today rather than buttercream. So let's get stuck in with our lesson today. I'm going to start off by greasing and aligning my tins. I've got two 8-inch sandwich tins here. We're going to cut out some baking paper to fit the bottom of the pan, okay? So what you want to do is measure out the width of your tin. And to cut the baking paper to that size, just cut the whole section off. But now the baking paper is usually wide enough to get two 8-inch circles out of, okay? So you're just going to fold that in half. So we're going to cut it in half first, just like so. So now we have two separate sheets. So we're going to put them together and I'm going to show you how to fold them so that we can cut a perfect circle out of them really easily. So both of your sheets of baking paper should be together like this. You're going to go fold them in half, just like so. Then we're going to fold them over again into a quarter. Try and go really slow so that you know what I'm doing. So now it should look like this. Now you should have basically two openy bits, or three should I say, and then you should have like a corner here where everything is kind of joined together. So what you want to do is fold your paper up to that corner, right? So I'll explain what I mean. This is your corner and you get the bottom edge and then fold it up into like a triangle, okay? So then you should be left with something like this. You're just going to repeat that again, triangle, and you're just going to fold your triangle in half basically. Okay? And then you should be left with something like this. Okay? Get your tin, turn it upside down, and we're going to point the middle point into the center of our cake tin. Okay? And measure it to the center. And then we're going to cut off any excess that is larger than the tin. Okay? Just cut off the excess. Now, when you unfold your cone, you are left with two circles. So now that we've got our baking paper circles, I'll just put them down for a second. So now we can move on to greasing our tins, okay? So get yourself a pastry brush and some butter, or just use the margarine that you're going to use in the cake. I'm just going to use the same. Very, very important to grease your tins properly, okay? If you don't, then your cake will end up sticking to your tin and then you'll end up tearing your cake when you're trying to take it out of the tin, which is what I did earlier. I didn't grease my tins properly, so some of the edges have come off the cakes that I made earlier because I was just in a rush and I wanted to get some done so that I can show you how to fill them. Just be very generous with the amount of grease that you put on. Okay, so get some butter on your pastry brush and I'm going to go in upward motions on the sides just so that I can get a decent coating. Make sure it's greased all the way to the top, okay, because cake will rise to the top of the tin. So that's why we need to grease it all the way to the top. And then I'm going to go ahead and grease the bottom as well. We'll do the same to both of our tins, okay? Now that I've greased both of my tins, we're going to go ahead and add in our baking paper circles that we cut out into the bottom of each tin. And just make sure that it's nice and stuck on and nice and flat, okay? And then I'm going to also grease the baking paper with whatever's left over on my brush, okay? Now, you might be thinking, why is she greasing the baking paper? Because it's non-stick. But I find that some baking papers, especially the cheaper ones, the cake can still tend to get stuck on the baking paper. So I always grease it just in case, okay? It's always better just to take precautions rather than regretting it later and having a whole wodge of cake stuck to your baking paper. We'll do the same to the second tin. That is basically both of our tins prepped and ready to go. So it's very important to prep them and get them ready before you start making your batter, just because you don't want to really let your batter sit out for ages after you've made it. You want to put it straight into the oven. So we're going to put those to the side. Now we're going to move on to preheating our oven, okay? So to make flat top cakes like I have here, so as you can see, my cakes haven't domed up. So normally when you bake a cake, you get kind of like a mound on the top. So in order to get them flat on the top and to have to avoid cutting that mound off and wasting the cake, what you want to do is bake your cake at a low and slow temperature. So I bake my cakes at 140 fan or 160 without the fan and gas mark 3. And what that does is normally when you bake your cakes at like 180, what happens is that the edges of the batter that are connected to the metal part of the tin, the metal obviously conducts the heat, okay, and allows your cake to cook. So your outside part of your cake will bake faster than the middle part of your cake, okay, and that's why this part settles down faster, and then you're left with a mound that kind of rises later and bakes later and forms a hump on your cake, okay. So to avoid that happening, you bake at a lower temperature, so that allows the entire batter to raise evenly and bake evenly, okay. So that is just a tip for you. So if you want flat top cakes, you want to bake them at a low and slow temperature. So 140 fan is what I keep mine at. 140 fan, 160 if you don't have a fan assisted oven, and if you have a gas oven, it's gas mark 3. So let's stick our ovens on then. So preheating the oven, I'll explain about that as well. So my oven makes a noise when I turn it on, and then it also makes a noise once the oven has reached the temperature that I've set it to. So it'll beep again. So you might hear that later when it does beep. So most ovens will have a light at the front of them. So when you turn your oven on, the light will turn on, okay? And then once your oven has reached the temperature that you have set it to, that light at the front will turn off. So that's when you know your oven has reached the temperature that you have set it to, okay? So some ovens will make a noise, some ovens will have a light on. If you don't either have a noise or a light at the front, then it usually takes roughly about 10 to 15 minutes for your oven to preheat, depending on the temperature that you set it. The higher that you set your oven at, the longer that it will take to preheat. Let's move on to the batter now. You want to get yourself a mixing bowl, okay? I like to use an electric scale because they're a lot more accurate than using the analog scales. But obviously if you only have an analog scale, that's absolutely fine. Get your bowl, and if you have electric scale, you can just pop it straight onto the scale, and you can weigh your margarine and your sugar straight into the bowl that is on your scale. But if you're using an analog scale, then obviously you're gonna have to weigh it into your scale first and then tip it into your mixing bowl and then scale on. Make sure your scale is on 0 before you start weighing anything into your bowl, okay? Using regular granulated sugar. If you cream your margarine and your sugar really well, you can just use regular granulated sugar and you won't feel any sugar grains in there. If you want to use caster sugar, feel free to use caster sugar, okay? 200 grams of granulated sugar into your mixing bowl. 200, okay, 200. Once you've measured your sugar into your bowl, we move on to the margarine. So put your scale back on 0. There should be a button on your scale that either says tare, T-A-R-E, or it says 0. So you press that to make it go back onto 0 before you weigh in your next ingredient, okay? And that saves you having to measure your ingredients out into like 5 different bowls and then putting them in. Okay, so that's another tip for you. I just measure directly into the same bowl. Just makes less washing up and life a bit easier. So again, 200 grams of margarine, okay? The reason why I use margarine instead of butter is because when you bake a cake with butter, you really need your butter to be at the perfect consistency and temperature. And if it isn't, then your cake comes out wrong. So if you're using proper butter, then if it's too hard, your cake will become dense. If it's too soft, your cake will be really greasy and oily. So your butter needs to be like perfect, at the perfect temperature, and it's really hard to get that right, and it's a lot of fussing, okay? So margarine is already at the right consistency when it's at room temperature, okay? It's nice and soft. And also margarine is a mixture of oils and buttermilk and water, and all that liquid in the margarine then helps make your sponge a bit more moist as well, okay? So that's another reason why we're using margarine as well, okay? So if you are using unsalted butter, then you have to make sure that it's nice and soft and the same kind of texture as your margarine would be, okay? And it's very important that your margarine is room temperature as well. Now we're going to go ahead and do the creaming process. So the creaming process is basically when you mix your margarine and your sugar together until it goes nice and light and fluffy and aerated. Now this part is very, very, very important, okay? So what happens here is when you cream your margarine and your sugar together, the bits of sugar are cutting through the layers of fat in the margarine, okay, and it creates small air pockets. Okay, so the longer that you cream it, the more cutting action that happens and the more small air pockets that will form. Okay, so that method is basically a way of helping your cake become nice and fluffy. So the longer that you cream your butter and your sugar, or your margarine and your sugar, the more aerated your sponge will be, and the more light and the more fluffy that your sponge will be. Okay, so spending some time doing this process of creaming and buttering your sugar, it will make for a better sponge. Okay, so let's start creaming. So I'm using an electric mixer. You can do it by hand as well, but it will take a long time to do it by hand, because we're going to cream it for at least 3 to 4 minutes until it's nice and pale and aerated. Okay, it almost turns white. Okay, it should feel nice and aerated. Okay, that's not done yet, but I just want to show you it's already started changing color. So it's gone from yellow to like a pale yellow. Okay, it's kind of gone a lot lighter. So you might think, oh well, that's fine. No, we need to mix it for a little while longer yet. So I'm just going to scrape down the sides of the bowl. So it should look something like this. Okay, so you can see the air pockets in there. Okay, and it's nice and aerated. Now the next step is to add in your eggs. Okay, so we're using large eggs in this recipe. So what we're going to do is I'm going to weigh the eggs that I use, and I'm going to get 3 that basically equal almost 200 grams or there and thereabouts. Okay, put my scale on, and I'm going to put my eggs on the scale. Okay, so these 3 eggs in total weigh 198 grams, so that's absolutely perfect. It's only 2 grams less than 200. So you want your eggs basically to weigh similar to your margarine and your sugar. So that's what a Victoria sponge is. Everything is at the same kind of quantity in your sponge. Okay, it's important that your eggs are room temperature. Okay, and the reason why it's important that your eggs are room temperature is because if you add now cold eggs into here, what will happen is that you're going to solidify the fat in there. Okay, and then that is going to split your cake batter, and when you split your cake batter, it's going to affect the crumb of your cake. Okay, so you want this to be smooth. Okay, first egg goes in, just crack it straight in. You can crack it into a separate bowl first if you want to, if you're worried about getting shell in your batter, and then put it in. That's absolutely fine as well. You give that a mix. So second egg goes in, and again we're going to beat that until that's completely incorporated in. My third and final egg is going in now. So now you should have something that looks like this. Okay, so it shouldn't be split. Okay, it should be together like that. I'm going to go ahead and add in a teaspoon of vanilla extract. Okay, this is optional. Classic Victoria sponges don't really have vanilla extract in. I like to add it just for a little bit of extra flavour. And then we are going to mix that in. We're going to measure our flour into a separate bowl because we're going to sift it in. Okay, and sifting the flour is really important because flour can sometimes have lumps in. Grab your scale, put your bowl on top of your scale, put your scale on. And not sugar, eh? We've already done that. Let's move that to the side. Don't put twice that amount of sugar in the cake, do we now? Self-raising flour, 200 grams of self-raising flour. Okay, so 200 grams. Sift that into our cake batter. Just put it into your large sieve by gently tapping the sieve on the side of your hand. With the flour, you want to add in a teaspoon of baking powder. So just measure your teaspoon, level it off. So 1 full teaspoon of baking powder also goes in. The flour contains a protein called gluten, and gluten, the more you work gluten in your flour, the more and chewy it will make your bakes, which is great for bread, absolutely fantastic for bread. But for cake, we don't want a chewy cake, okay? So it's very important that we don't work the flour too much because we don't want to develop that gluten, okay? You can also do it by hand now. You can use a spatula and just fold the flour in by hand if you're worried about over mixing. But you can just use a mixer and use it on slow just until the flour is almost completely combined in there. And then we're gonna go ahead and add our milk in. So it's okay, so like I said, we don't want to over mix this, and we've still got milk to add in there as well. So it's still a tiny bit lumpy at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape down the sides of my bowl just to make sure that everything is going to be combined in there really well and nothing is left uncombined. So I already weighed out my milk beforehand into a container. It's 50 milliliters of milk. I measured it out into this and left it out so that it can come to room temperature. Okay, so if you haven't done that already, you want to measure out your milk into a container, and if it's cold straight from the fridge, then it will split your batter. So what you want to do is probably heat it up in the microwave for 10 to 15 seconds. Okay, your room temperature milk, all of it, 50 milliliters. I'm going to mix it until it's nice and smooth. Literally probably take 10 to 15 seconds to do this now. Again, on a slow speed, you don't want the milk splashing everywhere. So that is it pretty much done. But what I like to do is don't do it fully, and then I like to just finish it off by hand, just to get a spatula, and I do the last few folds by hand. Okay, and that will ensure that you've got no bits lingering on the side, no bits not mixed in on the bottom of your bowl, and everything is nice and combined. Okay, and then you should be left with a nice and lovely aerated batter. Okay, it should look like this. Okay, it should be lovely and aerated, nice and light, and it shouldn't be split. Okay, it should be combined together. If you want to be extra, then you can weigh out exactly the same amount of batter into both of your tins to get even layers of cake. If you're not bothered, just roughly split it between both your pans and try and be as even as possible. All right. Another thing you could probably use is a ice cream scoop. So if you don't want to faff with a scale, you can put an even amount of scoops into each one. So scoop one in one and scoop one in the other one until you basically use up all your batter. So you can do it that way as well if you want to. You can just weigh it, or you can just eyeball it. Let's put our batter in our tins. So then I use an offset spatula and I level off the cake batter, okay, just so that it's nice and even when it goes into the oven. So they're very handy to have. You can just use a regular knife if you have one. Okay, and you want to basically smooth out your batter so it's nice and even. They are ready to go into the oven. Now, I advise you, if your cake tins can both fit on one shelf of your oven, to bake them on the same shelf and put your shelf rack in the middle of your oven, so that way you will get even distribution of heat all the way around your cakes. Okay, let's get them in. They bake for about 25 minutes, between 25 minutes and half an hour. Mine usually always take 25 minutes in the oven at that temperature. Okay, on the same shelf, yeah, in the middle of the oven. So that's the rack is in the middle, and then both of the cakes are on the same shelf. When you take the cakes out of your oven, you want to leave them in the tin for about 10 minutes before you take them out onto your baking tray. Okay, so that will help them settle, and they should end up like this. They should end up with flat tops. They shouldn't be domed at all. Okay, so leave them to cool in the tin for about 10 minutes before you then release the sides with a spatula, and then turn them upside down onto a cooling rack to cool completely before you fill them. Okay? A fresh cream filling. When you make a fresh cream filling, you want to whip up your cream to the right texture. Basically, you don't want it to be over whipped, and it's very easy to over whip cream, and if you over whip cream, it basically turns into butter, and you really don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to whip it to the perfect consistency for filling your cake. Okay, so I'm using fresh double cream because it tastes the best. A lot of people use Elmley. Elmley is basically a mixture of buttermilk and vegetable oil. It's an alternative to cream, so you can use that if you want to. If you like the flavor of that, feel free to use it, but I feel like fresh double cream has the best flavor. So we're supposed to weigh 200 milliliters of cream into our bowl, so get yourself a bowl. Obviously I messed up a little bit there, so weigh in 200 grams or milliliters of cream. It roughly weighs the same, so 200. So in my experience, that is enough to fill or sandwich your cakes together. The whole pot weighs about 300 milliliters, so if you want a big thick layer of cream in, feel free to use all of it, but in my experience 200 grams is more than enough. Your cold 200 milliliters of cream, you want to add 2 tablespoons of icing sugar. So I think about 1 tablespoon of icing sugar per 100 milliliters is the right quantity of sweetness. If you like yours a little bit more sweet, feel free to add some more. So I'm using 2 tablespoons of icing sugar in there. And the reason why I'm using icing sugar rather than regular sugar is because it will melt very easily into the cream, and then you won't get any grainy bits in your cream. And a teaspoon of vanilla extract also goes in there as well, just to give it a nice flavor. We whip it on with a low speed. Whip it with a low speed until it comes nice and aerated and it begins to hold its shape, and then you stop. You don't want to over whip it, okay? So we're whipping it to a medium soft peak, all right? Okay, so it's almost there now. Keep going slowly until it holds its shape, okay? That's it. Right, okay. So can you see? It's stiff, it's holding its shape, but it's still quite soft. And that is what we're looking for. We don't want to go any further than that, because that will mean that our cream is over whipped if we whip it any further, okay? And it will split very quickly. So can you see? It's holding its shape, but it still looks kind of soft, like, you know, like a soft scoop ice cream. It kind of looks like that kind of texture, just like that. Like I mentioned, I baked these cakes earlier, and these are completely cool to touch. I didn't grease my tins properly earlier, so you can see that the edges kind of stuck a little bit on some places, but that is what you want your edges to look like normally. So what you do is you get your cake plate, or whatever you're going to put your cake on, or whatever you're going to serve it on, get that ready, and then you put your first layer of cake down on it, get off. There we go. We are going to spread our jam onto the cake. I am using a seedless strawberry jam. So let's just move this to the side for 1 second. And we're going to get a small bowl. Decant some jam in, as much jam or as little jam as you want to put on. So if you like a thin layer, 2 to 3 tablespoons will be enough. If you like a thick layer of jam, just put a little bit more, 3 to 4 tablespoons, however you like it. So I'm just going to decant a few tablespoons, about 3 tablespoons of jam into a separate bowl, because as you can see, the jam is quite set, okay, and it's going to be hard to spread that without getting crumbs everywhere. So what we do is basically we are going to mix the jam in the bowl to loosen it up, okay? So what this does is loosen up the jam, and it makes it a lot easier to spread the jam onto our cake. As you can see now, the jam has become a lot more loose, and that will become a lot easier now to spread on our cake rather than trying to spread clumps. So bring your cake back, and then you go ahead and add your jam onto your sponge, and then you can just use the back of your spoon and just spread it out into an even layer on your sponge. All right. Very important that your cakes are completely cool to touch. So when you're making this, just don't fill your cake while it's warm, because your cream will melt all over the place and you'll just end up with a sloppy mess. So right, get yourself a piping bag, cut the tip off to fit in a 1M size tip. And then you go ahead and put your cream in your piping bag. This is an additional step. You don't have to put it in a piping bag. It just makes the presentation of the cake look nicer if you do this. You can go ahead and just put it straight on your cake, the cream, and spread it out with a spatula or a knife if you want to. You don't have to put it into a piping bag. Okay, this is just for extra aesthetics, just to make it look nicer. Squeeze it so that your cream goes to the bottom, give it a twist. And then go ahead and you want to pipe some rosettes. So you start on the edge and go round. So you basically just want to pipe an even layer of cream onto, I'm doing rosettes on the outside just because it looks nicer when you see the image. When you sandwich both cakes together, it just looks nice when you can see the rosettes. So the middle bit, I'm just going to fill it in, just as a single layer. So the rosettes were just on the outside so that it looks nice when you've sandwiched both of them together, okay? And you can see them from the outside. There, so that is, see, 200 grams was the perfect amount to do an even layer. Okay? And then your second cake, so this is the bottom of my cake, that side is the top. So when I took it out of the tin, I flipped it upside down onto my baking tray. So I'm going to leave this side on the top so that we have a nice and flat top on our cake. So let me try and get rid of the, oh God, stuck to my rack. Right, okay. So this is the top of my cake and this is the bottom of my cake. I'm going to put it upside down on my cake, okay? Just make sure I have the good side facing you guys, yep. And then just gently place it on top, okay? And then make sure that they are level and then press it down to sandwich it together, okay? And the last thing you want to do is get a little bit of icing sugar inside a sieve, okay? And you want to sift some icing sugar all over the top of your cake. And that is it, guys. We managed to make it, okay? So classic Victoria sandwich looks just like that. Perfect flat cakes, lovely sponge, delicious topping, okay? Is that good, everybody? Everybody good? So any more questions about the Victoria sponge? If you missed anything, if you need some more help with it, feel free to DM me and I'll answer the questions about it. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. Take care of yourselves, take care of your families, enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy your cakes, have fun. Peace to everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bye.